Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I thought I'd do a video just on that famous weakness, doubled pawns. And I was debating whether I should call the video, When Are Doubled Pawns Good? Or should I call the video, When Are Doubled Pawns Bad? If you think about it, it's sort of the same thing. If you know when they're good, then you know then when they're bad, and vice versa. So, in any case, let's take a look. And I thought I'd start with a couple of basic kind of things. I mean, we could start with the basics, which is, why would a double pawn be bad anyway? And the immediate answer is that the back pawn, not the backward pawn, there's a difference between a back pawn and a backward pawn. The back pawn of the two doubled pawns has less mobility. And we'll look at that in a second. Let's look at a game between Lasker and Capoblanca, and we'll try to get some idea of what sometimes makes double pawns good and bad from this example and some others. All right, so here in this game, Lasker was white, and he played e4. Capoblanca played e5, knight f3, knight c6. Roy Lopez, bishop b5, a6, Morphy move. Bishop takes c6, the exchange variation, relatively rare. Normally, when you have two pawns that can take, you take toward the middle, but the book move here is not to take to the middle, it's to play d takes. And now the move that Fischer made popular, and that is still popular today, is for white to castle here. But Lasker was playing a little psychology against Capoblanca, so he played d4 and threatened the e-pawn, and the best way to save it is to trade it off. And Lasker took back with his queen. And we could even trade queens here to get into the endgame if we want. Queen takes, knight takes. And now the question is, what does white have out of this opening and what does black have? Because usually grandmasters don't give up something for nothing. And this is a typical trade-off of imbalances this way. Well, what does black have here for his doubled pawns? And the answer is he has the bishop pair. The bishop pair means you have two bishops and your opponent doesn't. It really doesn't mean a pair of bishops. It really stands for the advantage of the bishop pair. Advantage meaning you've got it and they don't. So black has the advantage of the bishop pair worth about a half a pawn. What does white have? Well, white has the fact that his pawns are still in good shape, and black has doubled pawns. Black has the doubled c-pawns, so that if we draw a line down the middle of the board on the open d file, on the left side of that open d file, white has 3 pawns and black has 4, and on the right side of that green line, white has 4 pawns and black only has 3. So both sides have majorities on each side of that green line. But notice the majorities are not the same. That here white has a nice 4-on-3 on the king side that can create a passed pawn. Those double pawns mean that black can't really create a passed pawn. We were saying a couple minutes ago, why are double pawns weak? Well, one of the reasons why they're weak here is this pawn on c7 is blocked by the pawn on c6 and it has no moves. So it's messing up his mobility. But it also messes up his future flexibility as well. And we'll see that in a minute when we look at a similar position. So here, Lasker has the advantage that if we take all the pieces off the board and create a king and pawn endgame with just the pawns, then white would be theoretically winning, while black has in response the bishop pair for his weakened pawn structure. Let's take that pawn on c6 and move him over to f6. All right, let's do that. Here we go. Well, again, we'll trade queens here just for the fun of it. We'll make it black's move. Mr. Board Editor. Black to play. All right, black is to play. Let's go back. Do that. Here we go. Mr. Board Editor, we got to move the board around to go back. Here we are. We'll go back. We'll recenter the board for you. Don't want to have the board jumping around too much. All right, let's move it over a little bit this way. All right, so in this position, if black plays queen takes d4 and white plays knight takes d4, black still has a double pawn for the bishop pair. Is this double pawn for black better or worse or the same as the one we looked at in the previous example? Here's the previous example with the knight over here with all those green lines on the board. This is the one with the pawn on c6, and we're comparing it to the pawn on f6. So the question is that equally bad? Is that worse for black? Is that better for black? or is that makes no difference? So if you want to stop the video and figure it out, go ahead. All right, well, I'll tell you what the answer is. The answer is this position is much better for black than the one in the Lasker game. Why? Because if we draw that green line again, then on the left side of the green line, it's 3 pawns against 3, and nobody can create a passed pawn in the king and pawn endgame. If we look on the right side, it's 4 pawns against 4, and black's pawns are doubled. But doubled pawns here are not as bad when they're being used on the defense. In the previous example, they were in the majority 4 on 3, so theoretically they wanted to try to create a passed pawn. Here it's 4 on 4, so all they have to do is prevent white from creating a passed pawn. So in this position, the double pawns aren't that bad, and here black can stop white from creating a passed pawn. So the answer is this position is theoretically better for black from a pawn structure standpoint than this position is, because here white can use his 4 on 3 to create a passed pawn on the king side, and black cannot use his 4 on 3 with his crippled majority on the queen side to create a passed pawn. If you don't believe me, we could take all the pieces off the board, and again, I can't do that quite as fast here on lead chess as I could before, but if we edit the position and we go under board editor and we start taking all the pieces off the board like this, and we say, suppose we play this position, we'll click study, we'll do YouTube channel, bring it up here. If you play this endgame out and play perfectly for both sides, I think white can win with his potential passed pawn here. And if both sides play perfectly here, no matter how much you try with your 4 pawns against 3, if white plays it correctly on the queen side, black cannot create a passed pawn with these 4 pawns against 3. So this way, the position is much worse for much better for white and much worse for black than in the other example where the double pawns are on f6. Okay, so let's talk about double pawns in general. Double pawns, as we said, are weak not only because the back pawn can't move, and again, it's not a backward pawn. This pawn on c7 is not backward. The back pawn can't move, but also because of the flexibility. Here, even if we take the white pawns off the board on the king side, black's double pawns don't have the flexibility to come down the board against the white pawns on the queen side and create a passed pawn. So he's not only losing mobility with that pawn on c7, but he's losing the flexibility of the capability of creating a passed pawn. Now, what makes what makes double pawns weaker and stronger is their vulnerability also. If they're more vulnerable, that makes them weaker. For instance, if the double pawns are also isolated, it's the isolated part that makes them really weak, not the double part. For instance, let's take the B pawns off the board here. Go to our board editor again. B pawns go away. Back to study. Okay. Now these pawns are even weaker because there's no pawns next to them to guard them, so they're called doubled isolated pawns. Well, isolated pawns are bad. Double pawns in general are worse than not at all, having a pawns at all, so to speak. I shouldn't say not having pawns at all, but not having any weaknesses at all. On the average, having double pawns is worse than not having it. On the average, sometimes double pawns are good, as we'll see. But if you have these doubled isolated pawns, it's the worst of both worlds. How could we make these pawns even weaker? Well, we could get rid of this white pawn on c2 and put it somewhere else on the board and make those doubled isolated pawns on a semi-open file. I think Grandmaster Kaufman said if you have doubled isolated pawns on a semi-open file and your opponent has a rook or a queen on the board that can attack them along that file, then the doubled isolated pawns are worth no more than about 1 pawn. So if we do that, let's take the pawn off the board. Again, we'll go to our board editor. We'll move that pawn over to the D file. Let's put it on D3 here. And we'll continue here with our study. In this position, now black has doubled isolated pawns on a semi-open file. Semi-open because white has no pawns on the file. If it's just a king and pawn endgame, that's still pretty bad. But if we have like a rook and pawn endgame here, or maybe even a queen and pawn endgame, then the fact that the rook can attack those doubled isolated pawns along the file, the C file, and make black try to guard them makes them so weak that Grandmaster Kaufman said that these pawns are only worth about 1 pawn. In fact, I believe Grandmaster Kaufman wrote an article. I have his article on an imbalance of material on my website, but he wrote a follow-up article about doubled pawns. So if you Google, Grandmaster Larry Kaufman doubled pawns, you might be able to find that article somewhere on the web about double pawns. All right, let's look at a game that one of my friends played. I had a friend of mine who wanted to play against strong players. He was rated about 1,500, and he loved to play in the under 2,200 sections of the big tournaments. And one time I watched a game that he played, and let's see here if I can pop the game up. There it is. So I was watching a game he was playing in the under 2,200 section, and he was white. And I don't remember all the moves exactly, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to get to almost exactly the right position here. So let's play out the game. My friend, the 1,500 player, was white. He played e4, black played e5. He played knight f3, black played knight c6. He played bishop c4, which is the Italian game. Black played bishop c5, gioco piano. Knight c3, knight f6. Sort of like a 4 knights game now. d3, d6, castle. Black could play bishop to g4 here, but I'm going to transpose into the game. He played bishop e6. And my 1,500 friend said, oh, that's a blunder. My 2,100 player made a blunder. He let me double his pawn, so he quickly took the bishop. Black, of course, took back. F takes e6. White played queen e2. Black castled. White played bishop e3. Says, you're not going to double my pawns. If you take my bishop, I can take back with the queen and I won't have double pawns. Black says, no thanks, I won't take anyway. White said, well, that's another blunder. I can take your bishop and double your pawn some more. Black, of course, takes back toward the center, giving him a semi-open A file. At some point, White wanted to move his rook and was worried about his A pawn, so he played something like A3. Black now got his queen going toward the king side with queen E8. White says, okay, classically, I want to get my rooks in the middle. He played rook fe1. Black got his queen on the same line with the king. White got his other rook in the middle. Black played rook f7. And maybe here White did something like get his king out of the line with the queen by playing king h1. And now Black doubled his rooks by playing rook a f8. And at this point, maybe I left one move later. It's possible White played something like rook d2 and Black played knight h5 or something like that. But if you look at Stockfish's evaluation of the position, notice White has no doubled pawns, and all of White's pieces are in the middle where he's trying to get center control. All of Black's pieces are toward the king side except for his queen knight, but he has that semi-open file on the f file, and his rooks are doubled on that file. And if you look at the evaluation of the position up here on the right where I have it in green, where I put the cursor, the computer says that Black is up 3.7 pawns here. Well, it only takes about a 1.0 advantage before the engine thinks that you might be winning with best play. And here Black's up 3.7, which means that Black's completely killing White here in this position, even though the only differences in the pawn structure is Black has those two doubled pawns and White has perfect pawns, so to speak, perfect in quotes. But Black is winning by 3.7. Well, I went away and I came back a while later, and my friend, my 1,500 friend, was putting his pieces away in the box, and I said to him, did you lose? And he said, yeah, I did. And I said, yeah, when I left, things didn't look too good. And he says, you know what was funny about this game? And I said, no, what? And he said, my opponent did everything wrong and I did everything right. And I'm like, really? He said, yeah. And I said, are you referring to the fact that he had two sets of double pawns and you didn't have any double pawns? And the 1,500 player said to me, of course. He said, double pawns are bad. And I said to him, maybe you should read my book, Elements of Positional Evaluation. He said, what's that? I said, that's the first book that I wrote about the power of the pieces and what makes them strong. And here, the black rooks on the semi-open F file attacking the white king are way, way, way stronger than the white rooks, which are centralized on D1 and E1. In fact, I came up with a little principle that I think covers stuff like this, which is If you have the only semi-open file on the board, or in this case, the only two semi-open files on the board, and there's no other open files on the board that your opponent can put his rooks on, so that you have the semi-open file and he doesn't. And usually you get a semi-open file when you either double your pawns or you lose a pawn. But if you have the only semi-open file on the board and you can use it like this, it's a big advantage to have that only semi-open file if you can do something like this. If we would take the d-pawns off the board here and give white another open file in the middle, white's disadvantage in this position would be far less than it would be in the position where black is the only one who can really use his rooks to penetrate into the position. So, of course, this was a game between a 1500 and a 2100. The 2100 instinctively and from experience knew all these things. He knew that if he could take f takes e6 in this position, I'll draw a little line there, that pawn would stop the knight from coming up later. It would give him an extra pawn in the middle. It would give him this semi-open file for his rooks. He realized that that was really good for him. The 1500, on the other hand, just knew double pawns are bad. So he took the bishop here, bishop takes e6. Well, you could see the computer thinks bishop takes e6 is not a terrible move. It's the second best move. It does say the best move is not to take the bishop. But the point is, it's not really bad for black when this happens. And if white continues to not take advantage of this and lets black start to put all his pieces on the king side, you can see black's advantage is growing and growing with each move here as black makes better and better use of his king side piece activity against white's king. So this is a pretty big advantage here for black. All right, so we've now seen that in this kind of position, these double pawns are not only not bad, they're actually kind of good if you can get something like this. You have to be, again, very careful. If we took those d-pawns off the board, would those e-pawns be as good for black? And the answer is no, because then they'd be doubled and isolated. And that would make them really bad. And if we took the white e-pawn on e4 and put it somewhere else so that those pawns were on a semi-open file, then they'd be really, really weak. So, again, doubled pawns, usually bad. They ruin the mobility of the back pawn of the two. They lower the flexibility of the pawn structure. But here, the pawns are very flexible. The black can play d5 later if he needs to, or he could just keep the pawns here, and he has all those extra pawns in the center, guarding more of the central squares, and he's making great use of those semi-open files. Let's look at one more example. We'll look at the Paulson position. Let's go over here to the Paulson. Okay, so in the Paulson, a lot of times, or in it's very similar to the Taimanov. The Taimanov and the Paulson are like cousins. A lot of times in the Taimanov or Paulson Sicilian, black likes to play bishop b4 and threaten to take the knight on c3. So let's see what happens if white just lets him do that. So let's go e4, c5. There's our Sicilian. Knight f3, e6. We can also get there through knight c6. It could transpose. White plays d4, open Sicilian. Trade the side pawn for the center pawn. C takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight c6. Knight c3. Queen c7. This is sort of a standard position for either a Taimanov or it could be a Paulson, depending on whether black develops his knight to f6 or not. If it goes to f6, it's usually more of a Paulson. Could even transpose into a Skavenigan. Let's say white just goes to castle with bishop e2. And now black says, ooh, look, I can threaten to double those pawns with bishop to b4. Okay, should white try to stop him? Should white play a move like queen to d3 so that if the bishop takes the knight, he can take back with the queen and he won't get double pawns? Well, no, he actually doesn't have to do that. He could dynamically play castle here. And now, if you look at the top three moves for black, none of the top three moves, a6, knight, f6, bishop e7, are to double and isolate those pawns. But let's see what happens if he does. If he takes the knight, the engine actually says white can now play the Zwischenzug, knight to b5, threatening to take the bishop, threatening the queen, and threatening knight d6 check. But we're going to ignore that and just simply take back on c3 to reach the position I want to talk about. So let's say he just takes back. Now you might say, wow, look at those doubled isolated pawns. They're really, really, really weak. They're on a semi-open file. There's already a queen on the c file. White has doubled isolated pawns on the C file. He has an isolated A pawn. And you might think, wow, White's in big trouble here positionally. He's got these doubled isolated pawns and a weak isolated A pawn. Black's way, way better. In fact, it's Black's move on top of everything else, so Black can do anything he wants here. If White has any threats, he can meet it. If he's worried about knight b5 followed by knight d6 check, he can simply play a6 to stop the knight from going there. And you might think positionally this is way better for Black. All right, but I chose this for a reason. I wanted you to see the evaluation. If you look at the evaluation on the screen, Black's best move leaves White with a 3.0 pawn advantage. Black's second best move is 3.3 for White, and Black's third best move, knight f6, is 4.5 for White. So in this position, White is killing Black. Black could actually resign, even though the material is even though White has all these weak pawns. Well, this leads to a very important principle, which is static ideas take back seats to dynamic ideas. And here, the dynamic ideas for White is he not only has the bishop pair, which is a material advantage, but Black is fairly weak on the dark squares. If we circle the dark squares here, he's got his central pawns on light squares, and he has no dark squared bishop to guard those squares, and White has a bishop that's of that color, the dark square bishop on c1. And I have a general principle that follows this, which is good to know. It's a little wordy, but it's good to know. And that is, if somebody is weak on a certain color complex, in this case, the Black is weak on his dark square complex, and your opponent has a bishop of that color and you don't, and the queens are on the board, that's worth at least -1 pawn for the person who's weak on those squares. So here this is true. Black is weak on the dark squares. White has a dark square bishop and Black doesn't. And the queens are on the board, meaning you can successfully pull off attacks. I'm claiming that's at least worth -1 point advantage to White in addition to anything else he has. And here it's really tremendously strong. And White has a tremendous dynamic position here with a lot of potential for attack. Let's look at maybe the number one move here for Black, which is to play knight takes d4. You might think knight takes d4 is a terrible, horrible move for Black because White can take back with a pawn, undoubling his pawns, unisolating his pawns, and getting a really strong center. Yet if Black plays that move, knight takes d4, look at the moves for White. It actually says that White is ahead by 2.6 if he takes with the pawn, which we already said looks very good for White. But he's actually even better if he keeps the doubled isolated pawns and takes with the queen. The best move here is not to undouble your pawns, not to grab that central pawn majority, but just keep attacking his dark squares with the queen. And now the queen is threatening the pawn on g7. Let's say Black tries to stop him with knight f6 to develop the knight. Now the engine says White should play bishop to a3, stopping Black from castling him, keeping his king right in the middle, and keeping an eye on this really, really weak d6 square. And now if you were Black, you should really start to feel the pressure that even though you have the better pawn structure, this bishop on a3 is like worth more than a rook. It's just a monster piece. White's advantage has grown to even greater. It's up to 4.8 now. We could play a few more moves playing the best move for both sides, and you'll get the idea. It says Black should play e5. White's in no hurry here. He just plays queen d3. Let's say Black tries to get his bishop out with b6. White will continue his attack on the dark squares with queen to g3, threatening the pawn. How does Black save it? Best move is rook g8. He wasn't going to castle anyway. Now it says White should continue to open lines with f4. It says he could also play just rook a d1, threatening bishop d6 and then taking the e pawn. It says if knight takes e4, queen h4, threatening the knight, threatening the h pawn, which would hit the rook. Gives knight c5, blocking the bishop. Queen takes h7. Rook saves itself on f8. Queen takes g7, continuing the massacre on the dark squares. Bishop b7, developing the bishop, hoping to castle queenside. White says, no, 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 I'm going to do the same trick on the queen side. You can't castle over there. D6 for black. F4, breaking open more lines for white. And the bishop pair is a monster here. White's up a pawn. And black can't castle. His king's caught in the middle. And right now it says that white's advantage is 5.7. Monster advantage. But my point was that the dynamics of the position really outweighed the statics here. It's true those pawns on c3 and c2 are pretty weak, but they never really came into play. All the other pieces were doing all the heavy work. If they were the only issues on the board, if white didn't have the bishop pair, if black wasn't weak on the dark squares, if white didn't have that extra dark squared bishop that black can't neutralize, then none of this would have been a problem for black, and he would have had some good play against those c2 and c. I'm not saying you should go out and try to isolate and double your pawns on semi-open files. I'm just trying to show you that those kind of things are often not the most critical things in the position. I'll leave you with a little funny story I once had. I was giving one of my first lessons to a student, and way back in the 80s and 90s, there was a character on Saturday Night Live called Mr. Bill, and they used to run him over with tractors and throw him out the window, and he was this little doll-like thing that they would like flatten like a pancake. And whenever Mr. Bill got into trouble, the guy doing the voice for Mr. Bill would go, "Oh no!" So I had a student once, and he got to a position where he could have done all kinds of good things, but he was so worried about getting a double pawn that he was forgetting everything else on the board, and he just like, I can't do that. I would get double pawns. I can't do that. It was double pawns. So I was doing my Mr. Bill imitation, and I said, "Oh no, not double pawns," meaning, oh, it's such a terrible thing that you would get double pawns and otherwise be winning the game. And my student said, "Dan, you yelled at me." And I said, well, I used a slightly higher volume because I was imitating Saturday Night Live's Mr. Bill, who, whenever he gets in trouble, goes, "Oh no." So when you said you were worried about double pawns, I said, "Oh no, not double pawns." And I was just trying to show you that, you know, in this case, double pawns really weren't that bad. And he says, "Okay, I didn't know that. I understand now." He says, "But I really can't take lessons from people who yell at me, so I'm afraid this is going to have to be our last lesson." So I felt really bad because I don't want to ever make my students feel bad, and I was just trying to give him the idea that, oh, the double pawns really weren't that bad by my Mr. Bill imitation, but he took it, unfortunately, very badly, and I lost a student, so I feel bad about that. But I'm telling you the story because, not that I want to lose any students, but I want to tell you that double pawns aren't always that bad, so if you see a double pawn, sometimes you can say to yourself, "Oh no, not double pawns." And maybe it'll be that the double pawns in your situation aren't that bad. On the average, are double pawns worse than not having double pawns? And the answer is yes. But in some positions, they're tolerable, and in some positions, they're actually pretty good. And I think some of the examples we showed you today will help you with that. All right, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please tell people about my channel. I'd like to thank everyone for helping me get out to 5,000 subscribers. It's really been great. I've been trying to figure out ways to, reward people for helping me do that. Maybe a free lesson or two. I haven't quite figured out what to do. But in any case, thanks a lot for helping me. Please spread the word on the channel. If you like the video, you can like it. You can subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.